You're not going to turn off my video?
Welcome. My name is Chantal Lionge-Outhaat. I'm the president of Women in International Security, also known as WIIS. I'm very happy that WIIS, together with the Embassy of Liechtenstein, have been able to continue our policy roundtables online in this COVID era. Our policy roundtables and policy briefs focus on gender dimensions of critical international security challenges. And I think our systematic focus on gender has really filled a real void in US foreign policy debates, and particularly in Washington, DC. And I would like to recognize Ambassador Kurt Jaeger for his continuous support of this series and for the true partnership these past few years. And I don't know, Kurt, Ambassador Jaeger, if you want to say a few words.
Well, thank you. Just welcome everybody, and we're very proud to have this cooperation for so many years now already. It's a very fruitful thing, and as you tapped into, I mean, Chantal, it's actually a gap. Nobody really covers this issue adequately here in DC, and I think you're doing a great job in you know, drawing the attention of the public here in DC to this timely issue. And I'm very proud that my minister was able to take her time today to join us for once. That's the good thing about virtual reality, that we can make these things happen. It would be much more difficult to have her attend if we had to be physically here. So I don't want to waste more time and give it back to you, and looking forward to a very fruitful discussion.
Okay, indeed. Thank you very much. Indeed, we are delighted to have the Foreign Minister with us today. Today, our policy roundtable focuses on the UN at 75, as well as the WPS agenda at 20. Both these issues, I think, have been high on the Liechtenstein foreign policy agenda. What we want to do in this roundtable discussion, we want to structure it around three main foci. First, we want to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of the UN. What have we learned these past 75 years? Second, we want to talk about the state of the WPS agenda, because I think actually the two very much go together. And then third, we want to talk about the future. To make sure that our audience, you, are engaged, we are also launching a few very small audience polls that we hope you will fill out and will feed into our discussion. Now, as I said, we are very fortunate and honored to have the Foreign Minister of Liechtenstein, Dr. Katrin Eggenberger, join us for the first hour of our panel discussion. Dr. Eggenberger assumed the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs, Justice and Culture in November 2019, and comes to the position with a very rich academic and political economic background. She was for many years the Chief of Staff of Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. She received her PhD in International Affairs and Political Economy from the University of St. Gallen, but has also studied here in the US at such minor universities as Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. We're delighted that you were able to join us, and I would also like to thank you and your country for your steadfast support of human rights and gender equality, and of course our small efforts in this arena. Now, Madam Minister, before I turn the floor over to you for some introductory remarks, I would like to briefly introduce our panel. Lise Howard is Professor of Government at Georgetown University and Chair-elect of the Academic Council on the UN System. Professor Howard has published extensively, particularly on the UN, and more particularly on UN peacekeeping issues. Stefania Piffanelli is the Deputy Director of the UN Information Center in Washington. She joins us from Italy. She has a very distinguished career in the UN for over 2 decades, particularly in the peace and security sector. Richard Ponzio, Director of Just Security 2020 Program and Senior Fellow at Stimson Center. He's a longtime observer of the UN and other multilateral institutions and was the director of the Albright-Gambari Commission on Global Security, Justice, and Governance. He's also the lead author of a new report that will soon be released, maybe tomorrow, at least by Friday, UN Charter Day, entitled UN 2.0 Innovations for Global Governance. We might also be joined by Asha Castleberry-Hernandez. She is a US Army combat veteran and a security specialist, teaches at Baruch University. But she stood for election yesterday in New York, one of the congressional primary elections, and it's not sure whether she will be able to join us here this morning in Washington, D.C., but I will introduce her if she does. So with that said, Madam Minister, let me turn over the floor to you.
I would like to thank WIIS for giving me the opportunity to speak about and discuss issues very important to Liechtenstein, namely the United Nations and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Liechtenstein is one of the smallest countries in the world and has no army. The upholding of the international rule of law and the health of our multilateral institutions are therefore vital for our continued sovereignty and having our voice heard among international partners. I would very much like to thank Chantal and your entire team at WIIS for organizing this event and selecting an incredible group of experts who I look forward to hearing from. I had the pleasure of meeting Chantal in Washington in March, right before much of the world went into some form of lockdown. I'm very appreciative of the years-long relationship since 2016 WIIS has developed with our embassy in Washington, organizing numerous roundtables and regularly issuing policy briefs with a special focus on the WPS agenda and the gender dimensions of crucial security challenges. Though we are not yet able to go back to normal at this time, it is wonderful that this series can continue virtually with the added advantage of accessing people from all over the world. Thank you so much. Coming to my intervention, this year marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter, a landmark achievement for multilateralism and the international rules-based order. It also marks the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which has empowered many women around the globe. 2020 is a celebratory year for the international community. Needless to say that the first half of the year has been different to what we would have wished for. The COVID-19 pandemic has had devastating health as well as socio-economic effects on all countries around the world. It has also brought to light pre-existing and pervasive inequalities and unfortunately has exacerbated many of them. The virus is not more or less contagious for a certain gender, yet it has affected women and girls disproportionately nationally in many ways. Most frontline health workers who have risked or lost their lives are women. Women bear the burden of unpaid care work, such as taking care of sick family members and homeschooling children. Many girls have had limited or no access to remote learning, and their chances to return to school are lower than the ones of boys. Domestic violence has increased along with other harmful practices, such as early and child marriage. Most concerning to me, however, this pandemic has threatened our common achievements for gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls over the past decades. To step up for women's rights is as important today as it was 25 years ago, when we adopted the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The limited implementation of this agenda is catching up with us during the pandemic and cause for shadow pandemics for women and girls in particular. The pandemic has also shown the interconnectedness with other global challenges. Climate change is one of them. 2019 marks the end of the warmest decade ever recorded. CO2 levels and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rose to new records last year. A healthy ecosystem and biological diversity would help better protect us from diseases and would make it more difficult for pathogens to spread rapidly. Armament and nuclear threats is another global challenge. Many states prioritize military spending, which is often the result of a security concept that is limited to a militarized dimension and neglects other global security threats such as climate change or pandemics. However, investments in health systems are investments in human security as well. COVID-19 has demonstrated that a pandemic can cause additional stress to vulnerable health systems, economies, and communities, and in particular to those that have already been weakened by armed conflicts. These global challenges do not affect humanity equally, but burden women in particular. The world's poor, the majority of whom are women, are encumbered disproportionately by climate change. And women and children are among the ones who pay the highest price during conflict. It is therefore key that our common responses are gender sensitive and take into account the special needs of women and girls. Equally important is to recognize that women are not only victims, but also agents of change. In order to build back better, women must play an active role and be enabled to do so in leadership positions. Women leaders, human rights defenders, lawyers, scientists, journalists, and many more dedicate their daily lives to promote human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development. Their contributions and voices are needed to effectively address the global challenges of our times and to build back better. Building back better also means building effective, accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels, providing equal access to justice for all, and promoting the rule of law at the national and international level. Women's equal leadership and participation is essential in fulfilling our promise for peace and prosperity for the people and planet as envisioned in the 2030 Agenda. The United Nations, at the center of the international rules-based order, will continue to play a key role in this regard. The United Nations Charter provides us with guidance to strengthen international cooperation and solidarity. We should never forget its value and defend it whenever necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Minister Eggenberger. I think you've really set the stage for our panel discussion, and we look forward to your participation in the panel discussion. Asha has been able to join us. Asha, I'm so happy that you're able to join us. I know yesterday was a big day for you. And I think a lot of people should keep your name in mind because you're one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party. So let's jump into our first panel theme. As I said in the beginning, we want to focus on three main issues. We spend approximately 10 to 15 minutes for each one of them. Then we'll open it up for Q&A, and I encourage our audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and also to answer our poll. And Julia, maybe you can start the poll. And while you do that, I would like to maybe start with Stefania before we jump into strengths and weaknesses of the UN. Stefania, what is happening actually on the UN side with the 75th anniversary? Because of COVID, we can't have this summit. There is talk about a declaration. What is happening and what's sort of the time scheme here? Stefania.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chantal. And I have to say that I am humbled to take the floor after the foreign minister of Liechtenstein. I remember during my days at the UN in New York, how active your delegation there was in promoting multilateralism, international cooperation and reforms, including the Security Council. And it is particularly encouraging to see that also your embassy in Washington is engaged with the United Nations and works closely with Chantal and her organization. So going to what is going on now in New York. Of course, as you all know, there is an intergovernmental process, which in our jargon means something that takes place among member states, to frame a declaration to commemorate an important milestone, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And this declaration is meant to be concise, substantive, forward-looking and unifying. The President of the General Assembly has asked the ambassadors of Qatar and Sweden to facilitate conversation among member states and come up with a draft. And they did come back with what is considered to be a very good draft. They came back to the member states in May. And the draft declaration as it stands now has basically three components. A sort of opening part that is meant to, in general, recommit the membership of the United Nations to international cooperation and to the achievement of the SDGs, keeping in mind that we are going through tumultuous times, and of course, on top of that, the COVID pandemic. The core part of the document is an operative part, and it lists 12 big recommitments that the international community is pledging to take to bring the United Nations and its tenets forward. They range from leaving no one behind, which is of course the centerpiece of the Sustainable Development Goals, protecting the planet, promise to maintaining peace and security internationally, having women and girls at the center of the UN agenda, upgrading the UN to make it ready for the challenges of the future, fully funding it and focusing on youth. The third part is a task for the Secretary General, who is asked to come back within 1 year to update the membership on implementation. Now, as of last night, there was no consensus yet on this draft. The process is proving to be difficult. And the deadline for member states to come back with their feedback has been extended for the third time. My understanding is that, of course, as it is always the case, there are a number of issues that are not good for some member states and others are not good for others. Some would like stronger language on Security Council reform. And again, here I remember the ambassador of Liechtenstein in New York. He was an active member of conversations on reforms of the Security Council. Other member states want less emphasis on climate change and the SDGs. And of course, there is always the lingering issue of sovereignty and non-interference that creates problems to other member states. And of course, we have to say that this is a very special moment in time. Many countries, some countries are becoming more inward looking. And of course, tensions between great powers are growing. That is not helping. However, I think we all remain very confident that there will be a declaration in the end. What is still unknown is the scope and the level of ambition of that declaration, and that it will be in some fashion adopted officially on the 21st of September. Of course, as you may know, the General Assembly this year will take place in a different format. In the large GA hall, there will be only delegates from the 193 member states who are presently in New York, and the heads of state and government will deliver their statements via video. So how will the declaration will be adopted? It's still a big question mark. That the current president of the General Assembly, His Excellency Muhammad Bande, and the coming president of the General Assembly, His Excellency Volkan Bozkir, are going to discuss. But let me tell you what is happening this week before I close, please. I think it was mentioned that this week is also a particularly important week for us because the Charter of the United Nations was signed on the 26th of June in San Francisco 75 years ago. There will be a high-level event of the General Assembly this Friday. And again, as we were discussing before with the ambassador, the beauty of doing things remotely is that we can all participate. So I invite all of you to participate in this event. It will be in the General Assembly hall with the President of General Assembly. It will be held remotely, and it is a highly symbolic moment to commemorate a document that is still very current and it's still very forward-looking. Lastly, I would like to invite you to join the Deputy Secretary General that same day, 26th of June at 1 p.m. for a wide-ranging conversation with the UN Association of the United States. So I truly hope...
Stefania, we will put the link in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And over to you, Chantal.
Okay, thank you. Julia, do we have some results of the poll? Because I want to come back to the draft declaration, but I also want to look at, strengths and weaknesses. So the poll, in terms of greatest strengths, about 41% is the founding document, the UN Charter, universality of its members, and greatest weaknesses, the Security Council, lack of enforcement capabilities, and declining confidence in global governance mechanisms. Richard, you've been a long time observer of the UN. What do you see, sort of briefly, as the greatest strengths and weaknesses of the UN?
Thank you, Chantal, Hannah, your colleagues at WIIS for organizing this important event during an important week. As you heard, the 75th anniversary of the charter signing on Friday, and hopefully we'll see a declaration finalized this week, but it actually would be adopted on the 21st of September in New York, what is usually the kickoff of UNGA Week. It will be the beginning of the UN General Assembly high-level segment. But like everything, and like today's panel, it will be done differently, remotely, but I think they'll have some in-person participation by UN representatives. And it was mentioned earlier, Chantal, thank you for referring to our new report that we'll bring out on Friday. We will share the link to that report during today's program. Now, on your question about, in this new report, we highlight 12 historic achievements of the UN. Now we're looking back 7.5 decades. I can't go through all of them. I'll just mention my personal favorite 3. Saving Lives would be the title of the first one, and that's the major humanitarian agencies, UNHCR and refugees and internally displaced persons, World Food Program on fighting global hunger and food security, and of course UNICEF, and just to name one key area, vaccinations to end childhood diseases. The other area that is often cited, decolonization, starting with a 1961 General Assembly resolution, but the work of the Trusteeship Council and many other action steps, including leadership by the Secretary General. And while I suspect other panelists will highlight peacekeeping, human rights, women's empowerment, let me note another one where I have had experience working on the human development reports of UNDP, but the broader development, human security, and poverty alleviation agenda, of course, most well known these days by the Sustainable Development Goals that Foreign Minister Eggenberger referred to. On a weakness, I'll just briefly note, because we could go through a whole list, no institution is perfect, and if we're going to strengthen it, we need to analyze it. That's what we do in think tanks. But just to say that this negotiation on the declaration the last 6 months really reflected, Stefania really referred to some of the key hot button issues, disagreements still on the Paris Climate Agreement, whether we can refer to it in the document, and then issues such as engagement of civil society. It's amazing how we've made usually 1 or 2 steps forward and we continue to take steps backward. But it's the background, the backdrop to these issues that we're all too familiar with. US-China tensions today playing itself out and the work on this declaration. We saw that the Security Council resolution on a global ceasefire, the overwhelming support for the Secretary General's call to stop fighting so we can help fight COVID-19 in fragile and conflict-affected countries, but with disagreement of language in a Security Council resolution related to the World Health Organization, we ended up not having consensus in that most important collective security body. And the last thing I'll say is the fear of backsliding, in fact, on the development and human rights gains that we've seen over decades. That came up again and again throughout the conversations on the declaration. And it's a reflection of the real great power politics and tensions at the heart of the UN. Let's remember, the UN is not just the Secretariat, it's a representation of its 193 members.
Thank you. Lise, I want to turn to you, and maybe if you could sort of hone in on what you really see as strengths of the institution or weaknesses of the institution, not so much the achievements or failures. I think we all know them, but what do you see? And if you look at the poll, is there something that springs out to you? Lise.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Foreign Minister and distinguished guests, for being with us today. Chantal, I want to give a special shout out to WIIS and to you. The first time I ever presented a paper at an academic conference was at a WIIS summer symposium in 1995. And here I am today. This is the first time I'm talking or presenting as chair of the Academic Council on the UN system. So we've come full circle with you at the center. And I just want to express my deep appreciation to you and to the work of WIIS in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's great to have you.
Happy to be here. And also happy to talk about the strengths of the UN, especially when it comes to peacekeeping. I've spent a career studying peacekeeping, as you know. And I often like to geek out on the scholarly research on peacekeeping, and I would like to do that for just one moment, if you'll indulge me. The central goal of the UN was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And we have 2 basic types of war in the international system. We have wars between states and wars within states. And I think we all know, without doing much study, that on the first measure of sparing states wars between them, that the UN has unambiguously helped to curb wars between states. There is absolutely no doubt that when there's a war or the threat of war between states, that the issue goes to the UN Security Council and it's worked out in the UN Security Council quite separately. I want to outline now the findings on wars within states. So civil war, the main findings in the Civil War literature and how that relates to peacekeeping. And I'll try to do that quickly because I don't want to take up everyone's time, but I feel like there is simply not enough attention given to these findings, and they're really quite striking. In international relations, we don't have many robust findings, but when it comes to peacekeeping, again and again, we have more than 24 robust studies that demonstrate that peacekeeping is effective, that demonstrate in many different ways that peacekeeping is effective. I'm going to outline those findings now about war in general. In the next round, I'll talk about how it relates to gender and sexual violence. So first of all, we have about 14 studies now that demonstrate that peacekeepers reduce civilian deaths in war. In other words, the first mission, the first idea, the first part of each multidimensional mandate right now, which is to protect civilians. Peacekeepers are protecting civilians, all else equal. It is unambiguous. It's been tested again and again in any way you want to measure it by different researchers with different agendas at different research universities, and they all find the same thing, which is that peacekeepers save lives. They also prevent the contagion of conflict, so they prevent conflict from spilling over borders and from expanding within the state where peacekeepers are deployed. The third major finding is they reduce the recurrence and the duration of civil wars. So when you have peacekeepers, all else equal, they reduce the recurrence of civil wars. We know that civil wars tend to repeat, and if we have peacekeepers there, they reduce the recurrence, and they also reduce the time, the duration of civil wars. Peacekeepers, this is the fourth and final finding that I'll highlight. Peacekeepers help to rebuild state institutions. So they correlate with more robust legal institutions, security sector institutions, and also more robust civil society after the end of peacekeeping missions. I will also just note that UN peacekeepers have concluded 16 large multidimensional missions. And we all know about the failures. We know about Bosnia and Rwanda and Somalia. But we have 16 concluded missions. So 11 of those missions have successfully implemented their mandates and departed recovering societies. And that's a 2/3 success rate in mandate implementation, which is something that the UN really, it is obvious demonstration that this mechanism is working. And I'll leave it there. So I'm just talking, I spoke a little too long. I talked about the glass half full dimension. We can talk about the weaknesses as we move along. Thanks.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Asha, what are for you the greatest strengths and weaknesses? Is it the greatest strengths indeed in the international peace and security arena, as Richard and Lise emphasized? And where do you see the greatest weakness? And in particular, maybe you can have, a bit of a US perspective, and the increasing sort of great power competition that we also see within the UN playing out. Asha.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. And I have so much experience working at the UN, and my last assignment was at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. So, my perspective is definitely reflected from that. And I've also, been taught the role of U.S. role in the United Nations as a professor. I must say, when it comes to strengths, I think the UN, with regards to going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and being able to pass so many so many international instruments, legal instruments, or non-binding instruments. They have been able to produce so many norms to where they're not necessarily binding, but they're norms that most states, especially that are member states of the UN, follow. And there's a lot of examples of that, as far as like not supporting terrorism, supporting peace and security issues, also making sure that it does a really good job as far as shaping the behavior of many sovereign states that are members of the United Nations. So I think that is definitely a strength in many ways, especially when you look at the piece of we need to advance or support more women and children around the world. There's a lot of just a lot of effort as far as mobilizing states to believe in that norm, and also moving forward, as I would say, as far as the level of weaknesses, I must say that when it goes back to peacekeeping, like with the panel said earlier, there are some strengths, but there are some weaknesses. I would say when it comes to the strengths, there is a high level of deterrence where it has peacekeeping has proved itself of preventing future escalation in terms of war itself. But when it comes to rules of engagement, that's where peacekeeping has lost its credibility, not be able to use force when it comes to trying to maintain its impartiality, but at the same time allowing the adversary to conduct itself against civilians, or failing to implement protection of civilians, has been somewhat of a failure in many ways. But as you can see, the UN is working hard to critique its protection of civilians policy. So another thing too that's very important to keep in mind, and when it comes to the UN, and especially when it comes to peacekeeping, which is the biggest project in when it comes to Security Council, is that there's a lack of resources. And when you're seeing that the United States has pretty much cut its budget down significantly as far as its membership contributions, that automatically impacts peacekeeping efforts when it comes to resources. So we can't afford the United States to cut down its contributions, although you do have where the great power competition kicks in, where China will come in and fill in that vacuum of providing more resources. But again, we need the United States to continuously contribute towards, significantly towards the UN. So these peacekeeping efforts are well funded, because when it comes to lack of enforcement, you can automatically see that as a result of not being funded well. A lot of lack of enforcement hurts the credibility when it comes to the United Nations, and also misconduct among peacekeepers is a big credibility issue, and a lack of enforcement issue too as well. We saw that play out in MINUSTA in the Haiti mission, where the United Nations lost a lot of credibility as a result of peacekeepers not failing to abide by the code of conduct. So what did you see over time, where the civilians, not necessarily the government of Haiti, did not want MINUSTA there? So there's some challenging times, but I think moving forward, the United Nations has done a really good job shaping the behavior of sovereign states. And when the United States is there to help the UN shape the behavior and be able to institute or implement those democratic principles around the world, it works. But when the United States pulls out and is not really engaged, or a lack of engagement, you're seeing where it's a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Foreign Minister Eggenberger, I want to ask you to make maybe a few, Stefania talked about the draft declaration and the kind of issues with the draft declaration. I would like to ask you to make a few comments on that, but then also maybe introduce our second sort of main theme, and that's the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And Julia, maybe you can launch our second poll. Where do you see this agenda going? Is it progressing, regressing? I think we heard from you what you think about that, but what are some of the main obstacles there as well? Please.
Thank you very much. Yes, from our perspective, the greatest strengths are the United Nations universality and the principle of sovereign equality. Universality means that all states of the world are members of the United Nations, bringing with itself the potential of dialogue and cooperation to tackle common challenges. From a small state perspective, the principle of sovereign equality is crucial. No matter how big or small a country is, they have one vote in the United Nations bodies. Undeniably an advantage for small countries. The biggest weaknesses of the United Nations currently are the political blockade of the United Nations Security Council, which undermines the United Nations capacity to act in crisis, as well as general belief in multilateralism. Related to this is the second great weakness that concerns not only the United Nations, but all multilateral institutions, namely the weakening confidence in diplomacy and multilateralism, in finding solutions to common problems. The resurgence of nationalism in some countries leads to unilateral approaches to the detriment of cooperation, as became clear particularly during the COVID-19 crisis. I sincerely hope that we can reserve this trend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What about the WPS agenda? Julia, do we have a result of the job? Voila, the result. So it's kind of a tie, whether it's progressing or at a stalemate. And then in terms of the main obstacle, most people say that it is a lack of political leadership or will. What do you think in terms of where the WPS agenda stands? Do you think it's progressing or regressing?
Is this for Julie or for us? Please, my sincere
for
apologies.
You?
For us. Let's see what you guys mean.
Okay.
It's hard to tell, but I hope it's progressing. I very much hope, but
okay.
We'll see.
Lise, on the WPS agenda.
Yeah, on the WPS agenda, I actually think there's progress. I would just note that the first piece of bipartisan legislation passed under this administration was actually to pass the WPS agenda, the National Action Plan in the US. And I will note that no one wanted any publicity on this bipartisan resolution in Congress, right? Neither side wanted to be seen working with the other. And so it was the passing of the WPS, the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the United States got almost no press. And I think that's a symptom of our problems in general, is that we're, and you know, we just talked about how one of the weaknesses of the UN is this new emerging competition between the US and China. I think there's actually still an enormous amount of collaboration and cooperation between the US and China. It's just becoming more and more difficult to do it in public. And so one of the strengths of the UN is to maintain those relationships as much as possible, to maintain a continuity of meetings and interactions and relationships, to make sure that the agendas continue, maybe sometimes behind the scenes, maybe not in the limelight, but that there is progress. Do you want me to talk? I can talk about the actual robust findings in the peacekeeping literature on when it comes to gender, peace, and security.
Let's get back to that a little later. Maybe
no worries.
Maybe
but
a quick reaction.
I will say that we think of peacekeepers and we think of sexual exploitation and abuse. And I will just say, if you look, and that is absolutely true, and it's a serious problem in peacekeeping, but if you look beyond the headlines into the statistics of what peacekeepers are actually doing, it is unambiguous that peacekeepers reduce the risk of sexual and gender-based violence in war. And that is very important finding.
I think, Lise, that is absolutely true. And that's also why the WPS agenda was so important and remains so important. Unfortunately, yes, it is true, the US and China are collaborating in the UN Security Council actually on this particular issue, but in the wrong direction, I would argue. Asha or Richard, do you want to jump in here quickly? Richard?
Sure, I'll go first. I guess in two respects, I'll say that there's been progress, but there needs to be more political leadership, as was evident in the poll. And let's quickly note, though, that Foreign Minister Eggenberger referred to the Beijing Program of Action, another anniversary, the 25th anniversary. It happens to fall on the 22nd of September, the day after UN 75. Those are the two pivotal issues that we're discussing in this panel today, and that will be celebrated, commemorated in New York this September. The two areas, though, where I see progress and more work to do, and something we've been doing a lot of research coming out of the Albright-Gambari Commission from 2015, it's national action plans. There have been, according to UN Women, and these are the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans, I think we were referring to the US one a minute ago by Lise, 78 as of 2018. I'm sure that there's been a slight bump in that, but only a quarter have budgets accompanying these national action plans. That's the key issue we're all, I think, too familiar with, and that shows the level of political support that needs to bump up as well. On the other area of progress, Secretary General Guterres has committed and very effectively overnight implemented that the higher echelon ranks in the UN system, that's at headquarters and in Geneva, very much gender parity has been achieved. It's first time in the UN's history, as far as I'm aware. And yet at the field level, that's where a lot of work needs to happen. Of course, blue helmet peacekeepers, as Lise was referring to, police, and we emphasize a lot of our work around civilian, highly trained mediators, special envoys. There's a lot of work to do to reach gender parity in those ranks as well.
Asha?
I totally agree as far as what you just mentioned, as far as there's some progression, but there's also some concerns too. But I do like that there has been some movement as far as more gender balanced representation at the UN. We did see that Secretary General Guterres has made that effort, putting women in key positions focused on peace and security. But I must underscore, just like what the last panelist said, when you look at the, in support of UN Resolution 1325, where we need more representation of women and peacekeeping leadership positions, that's still lacking significantly, especially in the uniform positions, where we need more force commanders as women, as well as special envoys. Women tend to skew towards the civilian positions, but again, we need more women in leadership positions, as special envoys, force commanders, to help implement more of those gender programs and peacekeeping efforts. So we still have a long way to go. I do support that. I do believe that we, as far as the existence of UN Resolution 1325 since 2000, that was a great start. But again, I see that at times, in terms of increasing the greater participation of women in peacekeeping efforts, has been, incrementally slow, gradually slow over time in terms of achieving a high number of representation. Thank you.
Thank you. Foreign Minister Eggenberger, I know you have to leave us soon, so I want to give you some opportunity to maybe have some last words for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, of course, and I'm glad that we're all moving in the same direction in terms of this last question, and also love to just add to what was said and where we stand at the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. That's the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter, and the political declaration on its occasion is an opportune moment for all of us to recommit to multilateralism. and the international rules-based order with the United Nations at its center. Liechtenstein has actively engaged in the negotiations of the declaration. For us, it is important to highlight the successes of the work of the United Nations in its three areas of work: peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. It is indeed the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals which I consider a milestone delivery of multilateral diplomacy in recent times. It is in our hands now to make the SDGs a success and create a more peaceful and prosperous world by 2030. At the same time, it is important to be aware of missed opportunities by the United Nations in order to do better in the future. This includes preventing atrocity, crimes, especially genocide, such as in Srebrenica, Rwanda, Syria, and Myanmar, ending the nuclear race, and effectively responding to climate change, among others. The event celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations should, in my view, highlight the relevance of the United Nations, and in particular, its central role in catalyzing and coordinating global responses to global challenges, such as to COVID-19. It should also highlight its central role in developing an international rules-based order and the rule of law, which continues to be of high relevance to Liechtenstein, which will celebrate its 30th anniversary as a United Nations member state this year as well, in addition to the 75, of course, that we're celebrating all together. But for us, a big milestone. We're already a member since 30 years in the United Nations. And I'm more than happy to also make a short contribution, of course, to the third round, if you allow. If you have another iteration, a quick one, I can stay for another 10 minutes in the line, if that is helpful. Thank you very much, Chantal.
Great. So let's then move to our third round. And Stefania, I want to ask you, in terms of, I have two questions for you, two brief questions. One is, what's planned for actually the 1325 anniversary? Is there a special report coming out from the Secretary General or UN Women? What's the thinking in terms of a new resolution? I know a number of civil society organizations are saying, please, no new resolution. And then secondly, the UN Secretary General has been consulting enormously, in all parts of the globe, has also launched its own polling. So what are the plans in terms of rollout for the future in terms of the UN?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Chantal. And if you don't mind, I start with the second, where I have more to offer.
Okay.
If you don't mind. And just to add just a word on, and this is me, not, I'm not speaking on behalf of the United Nations, but what it's very clear from what the foreign minister said, and also Asha and the other colleagues, it is so easy to spoil the reputation of the United Nations with one event, which would cover all the, what Lise was saying before, that overall, the picture is not bad. However, as an organization, as the United Nations, we cannot afford even that one episode. And that is where we have to work very hard. I have been with the UN for a long time, and I've been, as Richard knows, because we were colleagues at that time, I know very well what the UN has done over 20 years in Sierra Leone when it emerged from a bloody civil war. And I think the UN did an excellent job in getting that country swiftly out of a very violent conflict, and through a process, a peace-building process that is still standing. There is Cote d'Ivoire, there is Liberia, but what is in the public's mind, what they remember, are the misbehaviors. And this is really where we cannot drop the ball even one single time. And this is related to what the Secretary General wants for the 75th anniversary, but also related to the whole work in women, peace and security. What is our side of the resolution? I believe the Secretary General is pushing extremely hard in implementing. As Richard says, our senior officials are 50% women, 50% men. Our 130 representatives in the field are now more women than men. The head of peacekeeping always shops around and he goes and knocks at every door to get contingents that are made of all women. In Iraq, we have an all-women leadership. In Afghanistan, the same. So there is really a strong attempt to move in that direction. And my take is that there is progress against Resolution 1325. The issue of diplomacy, we are all, you know, we all operate in the world of diplomacy, and we know that it takes time, but the public is not as patient as we are. That's probably, you know, the issue here. And in terms of the 75th anniversary, why do I link it to it? Because the Secretary General is very keen on moving the organization in a direction that earns the trust of the public. As the foreign minister was saying, poll after poll shows that, you know, the public does not trust institutions much, both national and global. And this is a moment in the mind of the Secretary General to do something to increase that trust among the, you know, the peoples. Again, the charter starts with "we the people." So what does he have in mind? And of course, we have to give also to acknowledge that he got, some people told me, he didn't get a good deck of cards when he started this job on 1st January 2017. So he has a lot of constraints, and he has COVID. COVID, it is a moment like anything else. It is challenging every structure and is challenging the United Nations equally strongly. It's probably a moment, as the minister says, to work as an international community, yet we have not seen that happen yet. At the same time, the you know, infrastructure of the United Nations all over the globe is probably the most precious asset that the UN can bring to bear to the international community. We are present everywhere, and in these past 3-4 months where planes were grounded, the only plane flying were the UN planes carrying doctors around and medical equipment and so on. So you know, he sees that there is a lot of potential, and he sees an organization that has its weaknesses, that it is politically kind of stuck, that it is a bit sclerotic, it's a system of many entities. So what does he want to do? He wants to go back to basics and ask the peoples to give him feedback on the United Nations they want to see and the United Nations they need. Chantal, you are at the helm of an organization that has worked closely with the UN. However, there is no structured place yet for civil society, for the private sector. We like to use these nice words like multi-stakeholders, fora, and so on and so forth. But is it a time maybe to look at something a little bit different? Is it only governments who are meant to represent the people of the world, or are others also meant to be there? This is all in the mind of the Secretary General. And to do so, he has launched, to grasp what people want, he launched this global engagement. which is partly a survey. And I'm so glad, Chantal, thank you so much for running it through your channels. A large number of consultations looking at polls. The Secretary General is an engineer, he likes data, so he wants to see what the world thinks of us. And then, of course, a nice scanning of what the media says and what academic papers and contributions say about the UN. All of this is coming together. We have already preliminary results that I invite you to consult. You can find them in the webpage of the United Nations, un.org. They will bring a preliminary findings, but again, over 13 million people have engaged so far. We are many more in the world, so we need more people to engage. And what emerges overwhelmingly is that there is a desire for international cooperation. There is a feeling that the world is interconnected, and that is the direction where we should go. In terms of specific issues, it will not surprise you that the environment comes very top. At the same time, there is a feeling that the world is becoming more and more unequal, and people want to have access to services. And of course, again, because we are in the era of COVID, fear of pandemic and of health risks is becoming a top priority. So, you know, in a way, the public is coming back and rubber stamping in a way the SDGs, the framework that we have as our guiding principle. We are getting a sort of proof that it's the way to go, indeed. Over to you, Chantal. On Security Council 1325, humbly, I pass it on to Richard or Lise, who probably have more updated info. I don't know what will happen in October when the anniversary actually happen. Over, Chantal.
Okay, thank you very much. So a sort of reaffirmation of the SDGs, but of course also a lot less resources available probably for the implementation of the SDGs, who are already were behind, and we fear are probably even more behind. Foreign Minister Eggenberger, before you go, do you want to say a few words? If not, we'll move on.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you and thank the panel for this very lively conversation. And whenever you're coming next to the question about the United Nations 25 years from now, I would just love to add, Stefania, you mentioned it. I picture a world in peace as we envisioned it in the United Nations Charter 75 years ago, when we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined not only to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations, larger and small. And lastly, but also very importantly, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. And also to mention, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. These provisions are as valid today as they were 75 years ago. And I would just like to end by saying, I'm hopefully not only the only person here who has the vision of a more peaceful and prosperous world for this and future generations, and the United Nations definitely has an important role to play with regard to all of them. I thank you so much for forming this panel today about this very important topic, and there's much more we could say. Unfortunately, I have to run. I let you discuss in further depths, and of course I'm grateful that my ambassador Kurt Jaeger, who is doing an outstanding job for Liechtenstein in Washington, is still staying on this panel. And of course, he's also happy to answer questions if you may have. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chantal. Thank you for organizing. And I hope to be back in Washington soon, whenever you allow also Europeans to be back in your country with great interest. Thank you very much, of course. We look forward to it. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much for your contribution and for your support, both in terms of WIIS and the issues more generally. Richard, Asha, Lise, in terms of the future, you know, what are some of the recommendations? I know, Richard, you have a whole bunch of recommendations, actually 10, I think, but what would be your top recommendation in terms of the UN moving forward?
Thank you. And yeah, I'll be brief because I know we want to have interaction with all the participants following today's panel. And I won't get into detail then on the first one, a G20 plus, but just to note that the biggest challenge of our time for the next 3 years is going to be the socioeconomic recovery to the COVID-19 crisis. And so the powerful 20 countries, but working with the 174 other countries that are not represented on the General Assembly is extremely important. And there's an operational element, meaning we need to have a G20 Secretariat finally and more accountability of that important forum. But the area that I think that will be most interested to WIIS participants, a peace-building council. This would be Security Council reformed by another name, knowing that we haven't gotten very far for 25 years of working on expansion of the Security Council. The Peacebuilding Commission with 32 members has made progress in its first 15 years, but it's still an advisory body. It needs to be given teeth. And we have specific ideas where it would lead on those second and third order conflicts, especially in the area of prevention, not taken on by the Security Council. We have a new tool called a peace-building audit that works like the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council to monitor early warning indicators leading to early action. And the final point, which we can discuss during Q&A, is to replace the Trusteeship Council, which is all but defunct, had an important role, as I said, with decolonization earlier. And now we need to move on. That critical sixth organ of the UN needs to be used more effectively.
Okay, thank you. Asha? Your microphone, Asha.
Yeah. Yes, I think the way I look as far as the challenges and a way ahead, we should definitely look at what we're seeing in terms of the emerging belief of international institutions on the global level from just regular people. And I think that when you look at the UN Charter, I think under Article 6, there's a lot of underscoring about the United Nations reaching out to other international institutions to help maximize their efforts, and and they underscore the importance of collaboration. Unfortunately, with this mood going on in the global arena, especially orchestrated by the United States leadership, we're seeing where international institutions are being beat up. We saw just not too long ago where President Trump has pretty much said that he would like to pull out of the World Trade Organization as a result of what happened with him with China. Also, he has threatened to, I think, even pull out the World Health Organization. So you're seeing where the United States has relinquished himself from international institutions, and it's showing it's a reflection of how they feel about international institutions. And as a result of that, that's a big hit in terms of the political atmospherics going on in the international community. The respect towards international institutions are almost like being beat up right now by the United States. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for United Nations to work with other international institutions. But I think that overall they should continuously work with international institutions like Bretton Woods institutions to help strengthen them. Continuously do that with also regional organizations like the African Union, which is so needed when it comes to peacekeeping efforts. But again, we need to make sure that we have the funding, the money in place, the resources to help strengthen these international institutions. But again, there needs to be some sort of political strength here to help them out. And I think the United Nations should take the lead in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Lise, sort of same question for you, but in addition, as you're taking on this new important position as chair of the of ACUNS, the Academic Council on the UN System, what do you see as some of the priorities in the years ahead?
Thanks so much, Chantal, for the opportunity. I'd like to focus on two things, which is climate change, and Richard just invoked the Trusteeship Council. So, you know, we just saw the results of that poll, and I think that poll is reflective of a broad sentiment that climate change is probably the largest threat that the entire globe faces, and there is no way to solve the threat of climate change unilaterally. It's just a simple fact of nature and of the world that we live in, that there is no way to counter this threat without cooperation. And I will add that I always like to look to the past to find examples of whether there have been successful instances of cooperation. And we can look to the past on the hole in the ozone layer, and the way we have been able to diminish the size of the hole in the ozone layer is by working with scientists and working with academics and working with private partnerships to convince politicians to change their stances. And I think that that is probably the key to working with private industry, civil society. We have a massive global movement right now among our youth to come up with some real solutions to climate change. And I find that to be incredibly exciting and energizing. And I would like to figure out how ACUNS can work with youth and with this incredible new dynamic moving forward. Secondly, and relatedly, the Trusteeship Council on Decolonization is no longer functioning, but there is no doubt that the basic problem of racism in international relations lingers with us today, that the legacies of colonialism and slavery are not only relevant in the US, but also absolutely in the UN system. And what I would like to see for the next 20 years is a greater commitment to real equality, not simply equality on paper, but to real genuine moves toward equality. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I think that includes also, you know, gender equality. And I think actually when we are engaging in a gender perspective and doing gender analysis, we see all these other inequalities and ways of oppression moving to the force. I want to turn to my colleagues Z and Hannah to see what kind of questions we have. Z?
Yes, we received a question from Dr. Waters Samah from African Union Mission in Somalia. He asked, can the UN represent a truly democratic organization fit for purpose in today's world without reforming its Security Council to grant more permanent memberships to African countries?
Okay, and Hannah, do you have maybe a question too?
Yeah, so we got two questions that were about very specific country contexts, but I think we can kind of make them a little more broad. So we have one question from retired Lieutenant Commander Farzana Tani about the Myanmar and Bangladesh refugee situation right now and how the UN can work on justice in that genocide rather than just focusing on the refugee and human rights side of it, but focusing on the justice side of it. And then also a question from Maria, and I'm so sorry if I butcher your name, Dmitrieva, about Russia and its shelling of Ukraine, and how the Security Council can operate in a way that holds Russia accountable while Russia maintains veto power.
Okay, thank you. So there's both the perennial issue of Security Council reform as well as Security Council politics. And then the issue of Myanmar and what the UN can do in terms of, you know, preventing and combating genocide. Who wants to take the lead here? Richard?
Sure. I'll speak to the first question on Security Council reform and related to the last question about Russia and Crimea. Remember, the P5, that was the big deal that was struck 25 years ago. Previously, they were called the Four Horsemen, both Russia or Soviet Union at the time, US, UK, and China, meeting here in Washington, D.C., Dumbarton Oaks in 1944. And that led to the more inclusive conference in 1945, but hardly inclusive when only 50 countries. Today, there's 193 countries, and we're talking about multi-stakeholderism involving civil society, private sector, as Stefania noted. But just to say that on one hand, most people say, don't touch Security Council reform. It's toxic, it hurts the rest of the modernization agenda that is ongoing. We've been giving many examples today. Climate, I agree, is the #1 issue today. We need to focus on that. Some people think the Security Council should have a climate and security agenda, which there's a friends group that France is leading. But on the issue of can it be reformed because that would change its image and the legitimacy and the representation, absolutely, but it needs to be incremental steps. And we go into great detail in our research that a simple modification of Article 23 allows for these 2-year terms to be extended. And this could be for your larger countries, India, Brazil, Germany, China, Germany, Japan, and others, to become de facto permanent representatives, hopefully without veto power. There's a whole debate which Liechtenstein is a leader on in modifying the use of the veto, the code of conduct in the Security Council debates. But just to finish by saying, you know, we absolutely need Russia in the Security Council. These countries are unlikely to relinquish their veto power. It's better to have them at the table, and having constant multilateral negotiations, as slow and painful, and they constantly are blocking action in countries like Syria today, which are just so critical. There's criminal acts happening that need to be stopped. So I'm not saying that I'm praising Russia's actions, but it's much better that they're there, because the other major strength of the UN is there hasn't been a third world war, a great power conflict, since its creation.
Okay. Asha, do you want to say something about the politics of the UN Security Council and how maybe it has changed compared to the time when you were serving at the UN?
Oh, thank you for the question. I would say that, you know, with regards to P5 +1, you know, there, in terms of the internet, the politics, I would say that what you see in person, what you see out there versus actually working at the Security Council is two different things. You know, as far as the mood since I've been there has been a difference in terms of the role of the European countries, especially when it comes to France and the UK. I think when it comes to France, they've been definitely trying to fight off more in terms of trying to make themselves more legitimate, because they feel that they're losing some sort of power there in terms of being very influential as far as making in the decision making, despite that they are a veto power. But you are seeing, as far as the great power competition, where China and Russia are challenging the United States a lot more. I was there when Syria, when we was making a decision in Syria, where they blocked Ambassador Susan Rice's decision to make sure, as far as condemning what Bashar al-Assad was doing in Syria. So there is more, has been, you know, the great power competition era has emboldened China and Russia to take on the United States. I do believe that we should have Security Council reform, but again, it is a messy situation, you know, as far as people wanting to talk about it and actually get it done. So I don't think it will ever happen, but I think that for the most part, we should always try to fight for more fairness, and the Security Council is the most powerful, you know, branch in the United Nations, and we should make sure that the decision making is a lot more fair. But again, looking at the United States, when the United States is absent as far as leadership, there's definitely a big hit as far as making sure that we support those democratic institutions in the Security Council. Thank you.
Lise, any comments?
I guess I would say that I agree entirely with both Richard and Asha that we need the Security Council to continue, and we need it to function. And without this linchpin in international relations, I I would suspect that we would have a lot more war, not just more climate change and not just more disease and less cooperation and less development, but more war. So how to reform the council? I think that whenever we talk about council reform, I tend to hear the same countries, Germany, Japan, and very often not Africa or Latin America. And that is a problem, because the council still should be reflecting the population of the globe and all of the countries in the world. So, you know, when we talk about Security Council reform, I just want to make sure that it's not just this idea of including Japan and Germany and, I don't know, sometimes South Korea, and India. But and that is where the deadlock lies each time, is who to include and how to include. So Richard had some great ideas there. I will note that the war in Ukraine has very few casualties, unlike Syria. I'll just put that out there, that unlike Syria, unlike Libya, unlike Yemen, the war in Ukraine is actually a very low casualty conflict. It's been grinding on for a while, but there are the mechanisms of holding Russia accountable are in Ukraine, I would argue, are actually working and more effective than those mechanisms in either Syria or Libya. So there is, we think of Ukraine, you know, somebody in one of the questions was specifically about Ukraine, and I would like to just note that that in some ways Russia is being held accountable in Ukraine more so than in some of the other conflicts.
Yes, but it is, of course, not being held accountable within the UN Security Council.
No.
Because it can't. I mean, that Russia has veto power, so any of the great powers cannot be held accountable because of their veto power. But we've also seen, like in the past, where, you know, if the Security Council is deadlocked, then, you know, maybe the General Assembly should become more important. And there are, I think, some movements towards different coalitions within the General Assembly or maybe outside of the UN system that are taking place. I mean, this German-French initiative on the what is it? The new multilateralism movement.
Yes.
Richard,
Yes.
help me out.
Alliance for Multilateralism.
The Alliance for Multilateralism. There have been, you know, coalitions of the capable and the willing. Are those types of initiatives, are they a threat to the UN, or on the contrary, can help strengthen? Who wants to? Richard?
That we even need an alliance for multilateralism. This is what the UN was established for back in 1945, but it's a sign of our times. And you know, people have been bringing up climate change, pandemics, wars. The biggest challenge facing the UN that's undermining collective action on all these critical issues is the rise of exclusive nationalism. The Alliance for Multilateralism is trying to recommit ourselves to the principles which are at the heart of this UN 75 declaration that's being negotiated and will be adopted. But there's question marks about the level of actual real commitment and the action that will follow those commitments by great powers and even medium-sized, smaller countries. It is absolutely essential that we make these institutions created in the aftermath of World War II. Remember, we created League of Nations after World War I, then World War II happened and the Great Depression. And do we want to see cataclysmic events leading us to create something to succeed the UN? Hopefully not. Hopefully we can reform, modernize, and address the issues of our time. And that's why it's essential that talk about a G10 of democratic countries, let alone the existing G20 and G7, they're important forums. We should make them work. They serve a purpose. They build consensus that can be brought into the UN. But in the end, the UN is the only universal institution, brings real legitimacy and effectiveness, I would argue, by engaging not only states, but a whole range of non-state actors on any given global problem issue.
Okay, let me go to Z. Any other questions? Z.
Yes, so we have a question from Tad Ford, which has been answered by Lise, but we would also like to get Asha's thoughts on it. So the question is, what can be done to promote US awareness of the important work being done by UN peacekeeping around the world? Asha, would you like to contribute some thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. First of all, you know, unfortunately in U.S. politics, our policies with regards to the UN varies depend on the administration. So what we've seen since the Bush era, Bush Senior, is that it's been like every 8 years where you're seeing this variation. And I must say that, you know, under hopefully, you know, at the end of Trump administration at this year, you know, we will go back to a presidency that will see the importance of peacekeeping, like what we saw in President Obama, as well as President Clinton, where they pretty much put more money towards the peacekeeping efforts, and that makes a lot of difference. And also, they did a really good job, especially at my, you know, at the U.S. mission to United Nations, recommending better reform when it comes to peacekeeping involving resources, rules of engagement. So a lot of it is depending on the leadership at the, you know, at the executive office to see how United States pretty much sets the tone on the importance of peacekeeping. So as far as moving forward, looking now at under the Trump administration, you're seeing where that is definitely not the priority, and hopefully, and most likely under a Democratic Party, they would most likely prioritize peacekeeping efforts, and that is reflective when you start to see the United States will contribute more to UN peacekeeping or their membership dues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so November is a really important time. Please, Lise, and
yeah, I'd like to follow up on that one also. So just to note that the US is over $1 billion in arrears now to the UN, which threatens the functioning of the entire UN system. So it is really important that those funds be released to the UN. They've been allocated by Congress and they're being held up, and it's a serious problem in the UN system. I would also just like to note that there's a common misconception among Americans that it's mainly Democrats who support the UN, and that is simply not the case. I would like to point out that the largest budget increases since the end of the Cold War to both the UN's General Operating Fund and to UN peacekeeping have occurred under Republican administrations. The first Bush after the end of the Cold War, and then the second George W. Bush after his election in 2001. So just to note that we have a kind of an inverse relationship between the rhetoric on the UN and the funding on the UN. But if you just simply look at the years of funding levels over time, we see much larger increases under Republican administrations. And this is the first Republican administration where the UN's budgets have decreased so drastically. And that is why it's very important to reverse this trend.
Right, Stefania?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chantal. And just to endorse fully what Lise just said, you know, my job in Washington entails explaining what the UN does, and peacekeeping is, of course, a big chunk of what we try to explain, because the US is a major contributor. And our counterparts are both in the executive, but also a lot, we invest a lot with the legislators. And there is bipartisan support for UN peacekeeping, because there is an understanding that it's a very lean operation that, as Lise says, brings legitimacy that no other army would be able to bring, and is also effective given, again, how a lean operation it is. So we actually found quite a bit of support. What is happening, and in terms of the shortfall, is something that needs to be adjusted. And here it's me again talking, not the UN. Probably it is time to rebalance the way we member states are assessed to contribute to peacekeeping. And it is happening because, as you may know, before the US was by far the largest contributor, very soon and quickly China will become a contributor at the same level. The question that needs to be asked is, money brings leverage. How much leverage does the US want to continue to have in terms of the whole decision-making process? So that is a more complicated discussion that needs to happen. But in terms of how the US has been supporting peacekeeping, I would agree that it's quite bipartisan. Unlike other issues like climate change, like certain elements and certain parts of the work of the Human Rights Council, but not peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is a good selling point for us. At least that has been my experience in Washington. Over to Chantal, since I have the floor, may I invite colleagues to read The Economist this week? There is a nice, a lengthy section of the magazine, which is titled Global Disorder, not Global Order, Global Disorder. It is very well done, I believe. And it has also a piece on the reform of the Security Council, which I believe is, factual of what can be done. Lastly,
Okay.
I would like to invite people, if you could, our participants, to listen to a podcast that the Secretary General will have with The Economist tomorrow. Last, essential reading, Richard Ponzio's piece on Pass Blue, which has been issued today. Over to you, Chantal.
Thank you. I think we're getting to the time to close this session. Kurt, do you have any final remarks you want to make? Your microphone.
Yeah, you filled all the gaps I had in my mind, so not much to add. I just maybe one thing. I mean, I firmly agree that the Security Council, just technically speaking, is the most critical point. I mean, the really big things that happen, as long as we don't have the behavioral patterns in the council don't change, we will have deadlocks, and that is a real problem. I mean, I'm not very confident you can make major revisions, but at least this code of conduct thing should be something that some elements could be agreed upon among the permanent members, that they just don't abuse this veto power just continuously for reasons that are just not defendable. I mean, that would be a huge progress if we get a few real humanitarian dossiers going just because they refrain from these veto powers. I mean, that would be, I think, the first really important step. The membership, that's probably going to be a tough one to extend the permanent membership, and that I'm not so optimistic we'll get there soon. And I'll stop there. And thank you again for everybody for this fantastic event.
Well, I want to thank everybody for their contributions to this panel discussion. I think we could have gone on for many hours. Those who want to continue this discussion, I would like to refer them to the ECUN's annual meeting that is starting tomorrow, where you can talk about the UN at length from the early morning till the late night over the next 2 or 3 days. So that it's at ecuns.org. And I think you can still sign up for the different meetings and workshops, and you will find both Lise and Richard there. So leaves to me, thank you all for your participation. Asha, you in particular also thank you. You must be exhausted after the election. Stefania, many thanks. Lise, and good luck with the meeting in the next few days. You too, Richard. And then my colleagues, Hannah Proctor, Ziju, and behind the scenes, Julia Bavacic. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you at our next policy roundtable. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.